Hello, this is Curtis, and you're watching the Playing with Art show. In today's episode, we're going to be playing with plastic eggs and transforming them into mixed media eggs. Now, these plastic eggs are normally seen around springtime, but the egg is a wonderful symbol of new life, and it's a wonderful symbol to work with pretty much any time of the year. So let's get started. I'm going to show you a few different approaches to making these mixed media eggs, but for the most basic version, you'll need these simple materials: some white glue, crayons, white paper cut into little bits, a flat tip brush, some water, the plastic eggs, and some watercolor. It's best to use a set of watercolors that have some lighter and darker colors instead of just the primary colors. For the textured eggs, you'll also need some white Kraft paint and tissue paper, and it's also helpful to have some acrylic paints. Other helpful things to have on hand is some wax paper, a scissors, a ballpoint pen, and if you want to finish your eggs with a nice solid finished coating, you can use Mod Podge or an acrylic gel. Now the egg form likes to roll around, so it's good to have something to place them on while they're drying after you've applied paper or paint. So you could use a spice jar, some bottle caps, or you can make little holders out of paper and cellophane tape, as I show you here. To create the paper holders, fold over a piece of paper about a few inches, and I align it with the paper to get a nice right angle edge, and then cut that. I use that as a guide to cut with the scissors, and then fold that in half and use some cellophane tape to cover one edge. This makes it a little bit less sticky, whereas the paper tends to like to stick to the paint, whereas a little piece of cellophane tape will make it just a little less sticky, and also wipe paint off of that as well to keep it clean. Once you've done that, is just wrap it around and tape it together into a ring. This first type of egg I like to call the Scribble Egg because it's done with scribbly crayon and then washed with watercolor on top of that. So for this egg, tear up regular standard paper. You can use standard printer paper, and it's better to tear than use a scissors for this to give it a softer edge. But we're going to cut them up into about a 1/4 inch small square pieces, and it takes about just less than one sheet of paper to cover one egg. So I apply glue to the egg and then press the first piece on. The first piece is a little more challenging because it can slip around, so I like to hold it in place for just a second with my finger and then brush it flat with the glue and the brush. I do one side of the egg first and then set it aside to let it dry while I work on other eggs. And then once it's dry, I turn it over and work on the other side and then let those dry. Once your eggs are all dry with the paper finish, you can add the crayon. I tend to like to add 2 or 3 different colors, sometimes different variations of the same color, to create a nice texture. And then once you're done with that, is just to apply a light wash of watercolor. The lighter, more pastel watercolors tend to work the best. Once the paint is dry, you can add a finish coat optionally. I like doing this just to make it a much cleaner finish. The colors actually look better as well. And for that, I recommend using either a matte version of Mod Podge or a semi-gloss acrylic gel. The next type of egg I call the textured egg because it has more of a crinkly finish that's achieved with tissue paper. So instead of the white paper, we'll cut up tissue paper into small bits, and these can be a little bit bigger, maybe 1 inch or 2 in length, to cover the egg. And we'll use the same technique of using white glue. In this case, you can use a little bit of a watered down glue or just straight out of the bottle to apply the tissue. And you can choose how textured you want it to be. If you just want it a real subtle texture, you can just use a single coat with just a little bit of crinkling of the paper. Or if you want it really textured, you can add multiple layers and bunch up the tissue paper and mat it down with some watered down glue, and you get a really textured, bumpy finish. Once it's dry, use the same crayon and watercolor technique we used on the first type of egg, But this time, go a little bit darker on the egg because we're going to do a whitewash on top of that. So you want the color to really pop through. So I recommend doing a darker color or more coats. You could even use acrylic paints as well for this. Once the egg is completely dry, we're going to add a whitewash coat using white Kraft paint. So this you want to go somewhat quickly because we don't want the paint to fully dry because we're going to pull some of it off to get a texture. And then we're going to add a watercolor color wash at the end. So for this, brush the entire egg pretty quickly and then pull some of it off just by wrapping a piece of white paper around it and just moving the egg around and just gently pulling off and kind of pressing in the white paint into the egg. Once the white paint is completely dry, we're going to add a wash of real light watercolor. And I typically use the same, similar color to the color underneath the white paint to make them blend together. So here I'm just adding a combination of reds and pinks to do a wash on the red egg. And once those eggs are dry, you can add a finish coat. In this case, I'm using a semi-gloss acrylic gel. Now, one thing to be cautious of is since it's a watercolor finish, sometimes that'll transfer onto the gel. And so you don't want to dip your brush back into your jar because you'll get the color in the jar. So I put a little bit of the gel onto a piece of paper and then just use that to brush onto the egg. And the last type of egg I'm going to show you I call the whimsical egg. For this one, I used an oversized plastic egg, and instead of white paper, I used Kraft paper. And this gave it a little more of a defined texture and finish. Once the paper finish was dry, I added 2 coats of white acrylic paint. Once the white acrylic paint was dry, I added a coat of colored acrylic paint. And then off to the side, I took the same paint that I used for the egg and added some white to make it a little bit of a softer color. Brushed that onto a piece of white paper, let that dry, drew circles in various sizes, and cut those out. And then with those circles, using white glue, and just gently brushing a light coat to the back of each circle, I glue those onto the surface of the egg. Mixed media eggs look great displayed in a paper nest. You can check out my other video on making paper nests out of shredded paper. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment below, which helps other people find this video. You can find more inspiration and videos at playingwithartshow.com.